Good morning and welcome back to All Church Sunday School. I am not Reverend Renee Hoke. I am Reverend Jamie Plunkett, and I'm here today with the wonderful Reverend Jessica Vaquetta. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome.
For this conversation. We are continuing and actually finishing our series this morning on Philip Keller's wonderful book, A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. I hope that you have enjoyed the journey through this writing as much as Renee and I have. This has been a fantastic perspective on a beautiful psalm, taking a look at what a shepherd thinks about the shepherd's psalm. It has been a joy. And just so we all remember, Philip Keller, of course, was born in East Africa, trained in agrology at the University of Toronto, made his living as a shepherd working in agricultural research, land management, and ranch development up in British Columbia for a couple of years before becoming a pastor himself. And so he does really have, I think, a unique perspective on this psalm. So today, we're taking a look at two verses in this psalm, the first one of which is, "You anoint my head with oil." Reverend Vaquetta.
Yes. Well, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
So did you do your homework last week?
Did I read the rest of Psalm 23?
Did you read it in its entirety? Good,
Yes,
good.
I read the whole thing. I printed off a certificate of completion.
It's hanging on your refrigerator.
It's on my fridge at home, right next to my 2-year-old's artwork. So, yes, I have finally, read the entire 23rd Psalm. But when you think of anointing, this idea of anointing, right off the top of your head, what comes to mind?
The first thing for me is our confirmations. So the confirmations that we do with our youth when they're baptized. Because some kids have been baptized or were baptized as babies. And so to mark that, I've been able to participate in that liturgy and do an anointing of oil on their forehead. So that's the first thing that comes to mind.
I like that. I like that. For us, my home church would anoint any people that were going on any sort of mission pilgrimage or service
with oil.
With oil,
okay.
Kind of as a communal sending and saying, "Hey, God goes with you in this way."
That's
so
cool.
It is really.
I love that.
It's a really neat little moment before you kind of embarked on this journey on behalf of the church. And so, just this idea of anointing and celebratory moments and high holy moments and before significant events.
A marking.
It's kind of a marking.
It's a beautiful, beautiful practice. Well, and the other thing that I think of when I think of it, you anoint my head with oil, is Ash Wednesday.
Yeah.
And how we have to.
We mix the ashes with oil.
Mix the ashes with the oil and it's a little messy.
It does get a little messy.
As does Lent.
It does. Yes. So as we get into our conversation this morning, though, it's important for us to remember kind of where we've been throughout this writing. We followed Keller and his flock now all the way from kind of their home ranch up into the pastures where he has done all of this work to diligently prepare. And then up through the mountain path. And now they've kind of, where we've left them is this kind of summer plateau, this kind of high tabletop where the sheep are resting. It's getting warmer. They're eating. They're, last week Renee and I talked a little bit about animals that you have to avoid, some of those predators and those cougars and stuff. And we have to, some of the plants that, mountain death, so aptly named, that you have to avoid and kind of look out for as a shepherd. But those are not the only dangers that sheep encounter, especially when the weather starts to get warmer. As Keller writes, one of the big dangers that comes with warm weather, especially when they're on these plateaus, are bugs and insects. Specifically one called the nosefly.
Which sounds awful.
I looked at pictures of noseflies to maybe include in the slides. I chose not to. We don't need to see
You're
those
welcome,
pictures.
I guess.
You're welcome to look to search those on the internet if you'd like, but please be forewarned, it's not pretty. But noseflies are a significant issue for sheep. They lay their eggs on a sheep's nose, and then when those eggs hatch, they literally climb into the sheep's nose, eat away the flesh, and it becomes incredibly irritating and aggravating for the sheep, to the point that they'll do anything from just shaking their head constantly to actually banging their heads on rocks and trees and the ground, just trying to stop that irritation. And sometimes in significant cases, they can go blind and they can just be so aggravated that they try and try and try to stop the aggravation until they die. So it's a significant issue, and as a shepherd, as we've learned at this point in our journey,
another thing to add to your why I don't want to be a shepherd.
Everything about being a shepherd is incredibly detail oriented and requires a very heightened level of observation. And so this is just another thing where you have to really be paying attention to kind of the mannerisms of your sheep. You have to know your flock really well to say something's bothering them and what's going on and how can I fix it. With that in mind, though, there is kind of a preventative measure that shepherds can take to keep noseflies and other insects from really bothering their flock. And if you would, I've got you kind of reading a little bit.
Yes, I will.
From Keller's book himself, if you'd read that for us, please.
Two short paragraphs here. Only the strictest attention to the behavior of sheep by the shepherd can forestall the difficulties of fly time. At the very first sign of flies among the flock, he will apply an antidote to their heads. I always prefer to use a homemade remedy composed of linseed oil, sulfur, and tar, which was smeared over the sheep's nose and head as a protection against nose flies. What an incredible transformation this would make among the sheep. Once the oil had been applied to the sheep's head, there was an immediate change in behavior. Gone was the aggravation, gone the frenzy, gone the irritability and the restlessness. Instead, the sheep would start to feed quietly again, then soon lie down in peaceful contentment.
I like that.
Right?
That's pretty awesome. So I have two questions for you.
Okay.
Katie. The first is, what are some of those things for you that are irritating and, when they're left unignored, start to really become aggravating? And then the second part of that question is, what are some practices that you have that really kind of move you back into this kind of sense of peaceful contentment that we see happens with the sheep when they get the oil on their head?
Sorry. I'm laughing because I think I've talked about this with you before and other people. One of my favorite practices is in the morning, kind of a grounding practice for me, is going outside, sitting on my front porch and having a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And this summer and this morning, as I'm sitting out there trying to rest in the divine's presence, I become irritated. My soul and my spirit is irritated by mosquitoes.
Oh, nice.
That they just, you kind of see them flying around, but then you, feel them after they bite, and you look, and there's, all these red dots on my arms, and I'm like, oh my gosh! Which, ironically, what I could do is get up and go inside and put on some mosquito spray or lotion or something, or I could do it before I go sit outside, but I don't. So, the action taken to prevent the irritability of the nose flies, I kind of had to laugh at, and I'm like, oh yes, it's, trying to prevent this from happening. But in a more spiritual sense, I guess, for me, something as of late that I have really found irritating to me as a person has been when I'm out in public and I don't see people wearing face masks or keeping distance and I find myself quick to anger and quick to judge. And I don't think that is the person God is calling me to be.
Yeah.
And so I try to remind myself to stop and just say, Lord, help me be slow to anger. And I don't know that person's whole story or situation. So who am I to judge why they are invading my personal bubble or not wearing a mask in a store that requires it? And so it's just, a little extra grace, seek to understand. For me, when I find that kind of bubbling up inside, I go back to that prayer of St. Francis, seek to understand, seek to understand. So.
I like that. That's a really good mantra. I think for me, we just finished up finally after a long delay because of the pandemic, our disciples class with all of our kids in 6th grade, now 7th grade, who have been preparing for baptism and confirmation. Confirmation, which you mentioned earlier, has that ritual of anointing with oil as well. And a part of what we talk about, especially when we get nearer and nearer towards that day of baptism, is the tie between baptism and communion, and then how the latter of those two things, communion, is the reminder of our baptism, reminder of that promise that we enter into with God. And then from communion, there's always this sending every week into the world. And so trying to really kind of build for them a path to say, you start here, this is your reminder of the promises that you made at your starting point. And along with that reminder every week for us, we have kind of this action item. We're sent back into the world to carry the kind of residual effects of this promise, of this relationship, back into the world with everyone else.
Kind of like you've been anointed to go forth and do ministry.
You've been tasked with something pretty mighty. And so now let's carry this peace and this joy and this love and this compassion that we experience at the communion table back into the world with us. And so when I hear about stuff like that, which also really irritates me as well, and all of those other kind of irritants, it's really, I think, important to kind of turn back to this reminder that God is calling us into something specific, and that God is, we just finished some conversations with some youth, and the big takeaway is, God is calling you to live fully into who God created you to be, because that will make a significant impact on this world. And I think Keller kind of gets close to that as well with this quote that he writes. Keller says, "It is the daily anointing of God's gracious Spirit upon my mind, which produces in my life such personality traits as joy, contentment, love, patience, gentleness, and peace."
That's good.
It's this daily ritualistic reminder that God is with us, and that God's Spirit moves through us, and that we are called and compelled to carry that Spirit into the world, and that gives off a certain look. What are your thoughts on that?
I love that. I love that, because I look at this, and with the example that I gave of masks or space, I mean, it was not a deeply spiritual example, but it affects who your whole personhood is part of who God has created you to be. And your being, walking out into the world, that is God's light going forth. And so in what ways do we dim that light? By letting these irritants take over. And what can we do to prevent that from happening? And so I love this quote. It is the daily anointing of God's graciousness. And I think about when I read this, what are ways in our life when we can daily anoint ourselves? What does that daily anointing or that reminder of that daily anointing of God's Spirit upon us before we go out into the world? Oh, it has me. Do you have any daily?
I don't have any morning practices really. It's kind of chaotic in my house in the mornings with small children and online learning, especially right now, and 2 new dogs. But it's my practices come in the evening as kind of let me stop. It would be so easy for me to rush straight into sleep, which sounds weird. It's I just want to get to bed and just fall asleep and have some rest so that I can do all of this again the next day.
Do you do the old man fall asleep in the recliner?
I have fallen asleep in various places in my home, yes. And I'm a sleepy guy a lot of times. But so for me, the practice really comes in the evening to say, all right, I need to be intentional about stopping down and kind of reviewing and asking myself some of those prayer of examine questions of, hey, where did I encounter God today? How did I respond to God's presence? And how can I do better tomorrow? And so that really kind of sets me up, puts my mind at ease so that I can get a good night's rest rather than just rushing into bed and saying, all right, I just need to crash and fall asleep. And that kind of sets up my day the next day. So really, it's an evening practice for me. But I do like this rhythm of having some sort of daily ritual, this daily anointing, where we can say, I am spending a moment, I'm reminding myself of what God's call in my life is, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to move forward with that today. And it also should be a good reminder to us, because we use this language, this inside-outside language a lot as Christians, where we say, all right, we're inside at church, and then we go back out into the world. And so there's this really kind of binary that we
Yeah.
live on. But in the reality, we also say that God goes with us wherever we go.
And God is already there.
And God is already present
Yeah.
wherever we end up. Which really brings us to kind of the final line of Psalm 23. I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. So when you think of that phrase, when you think of the house of the Lord, what comes to mind for you?
Well, when I first hear this phrase, I can't help but, associate it with a funeral and memorial services and just like this dwelling in God's eternal house forever. But when I think about this kind of in some of the ways we've been talking about it, I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever, or I will dwell in the house of my beloved forever. It just means like that house, when you hear about like home is where the heart is.
Yeah.
Is that how the phrase goes?
I
don't know.
think
Someone let us know. We might not be able to quote that. Home is where the heart is. We'll go with that. But it is, if God is our beloved, and if it, the light that is in the deepest parts of our heart and our soul, then we are in God's house wherever we are.
Yeah, I like that. So hear this.
What about you? I don't know. I'm sure that Philip has something.
He sure does.
Much more prophetic than that.
I think that was extraordinarily prophetic. This idea of God's presence, right? It's really hard to wrap our brains around that God is present everywhere at the same time, because, and Renee and I have talked about this on All Church Sunday School in the past, kind of our individualized way of thinking about faith always kind of compels us to make ourselves the center of the story, when in reality we are not. And so really kind of breaking down our structures of thinking to say, no, God is present with you as much as God is present with me, providing you what you need and providing me what I need simultaneously, kind of gets us out of that practice of only focusing inward to say, I need to be more aware of how God is moving in your life. That might help me understand
a different response to my very inward answer I gave.
Well, no. I think they're both important, but we also need to be observant and say, how can I bring you peace today? Well, that requires me to do some observing, just like the shepherd observing a sheep, to say, I need to know what's going on in your life. I need to understand how God is moving in your life so that I can help.
The divine is there. Where is the divine working
in that space, and how can I partner with the divine to help you live into your life the way God is calling you to, right? And vice versa, right? So it's a communal element,
yes,
for sure, as a community of faith. But here's what Keller says about this last line in Psalm 23. There's one other beautiful and final sense in which the psalmist was speaking as a sheep. It's brought out in the Amplified Old Testament, where the meaning of this last phrase is, I will dwell in the presence of the Lord forever. My personal conviction is that this is the most significant sentiment that David had in his heart as he ended this hymn of praise to divine diligence. Not only do we get the idea of an ever-present shepherd on the scene, but also the concept that the sheep wants to be in full view of his owner at all times. This theme has run all through our studies. It is the alertness, the awareness, the diligence of a never-tiring master which alone assures the sheep of excellent care. And from the sheep's standpoint, it is knowing that the shepherd is there. It is the constant awareness of his presence nearby that automatically eliminates most of the difficulties and dangers, while at the same time providing a sense of security and serenity. It is the sheep's owner's presence that guarantees there will be no lack of any sort, that there will be abundant green pastures, that there will be still clean waters, that there will be new paths into fresh fields, that there will be safe summers on the high tablelands, that there will be freedom from fear, that there will be antidotes for flies and disease and parasites, that there will be quietness and contentment. In our Christian lives and experience, precisely the same idea and principle applies.
I love, I don't know if you're going to ask me a question. I'm about ready to jump in. I love how he said presence.
Yeah.
I will dwell in God's presence, or the Lord's presence forever. And presence instead of
house. Yeah. So that's my question for you.
Yes.
Can you give me an example of the power of God's presence for you since this pandemic began? And this is, a lot of times people know Renee throws me questions that I don't have ahead of time. This is the one that I've given you without any fair warning.
The power of God's presence
in your life since the pandemic began.
Oh my God! I mean, gosh, there's like so many.
Yeah.
I mean, in some of the work I've done, like through our outreach ministries here.
Okay.
And just watching people wanting to serve and help members of our community and our human family, and just this outpouring of unending generosity is overwhelming at times. I mean, that is watching God at work in the world. I know I say that all the time, but it really is. Each time I have an opportunity to serve alongside members of our faith community or members of like our wider Fort Worth community, I mean, that is, where God's presence has just been overwhelming. So, I don't know. What was the original question? Sorry. I feel like I didn't answer it correctly.
Where has God's presence been powerful for you in the midst of a pandemic? And I think just in my kind of ancillary observations of what all the incredible work that Outreach has done over the last 6 months, it's been really powerful, a powerful example of grace and of hope and of kind of communal love.
Well, the selflessness too. I mean, this just ongoing like generosity.
It keeps going.
It keeps going. It's like fishes and loaves. It doesn't stop.
Absolutely.
So,
I think that's a wonderful example.
I
think Keller kind of we've spent 6 weeks now with Philip Keller and this book, and he kind of boils all of it down to one sentence, which might be dissatisfactory for some. Others, it might be a nice little capstone to everything. But the final quote we're going to hear from Philip Keller regarding this book and this walk, he writes, "For when it is all said and done on the subject of a successful Christian walk, it can be summed up in one sentence. Live ever aware of God's presence." And so all throughout a sheep's life, they are aware of the shepherd's presence. Maybe not so much the work that the shepherd does in preparation for them, but they're aware of the pasture quality. They're aware of the water. They're aware of, when they feel safe and secure and when they don't. And I wonder if our challenge from all of this isn't just to be more aware of the presence of God in our daily lives, to understand all of the things that God is doing and how God is working and how we can be partners with God in the work that God is calling us into. It all starts with just that awareness of God's presence.
I do yoga.
Yes.
And at the end of the practice, oftentimes people say namaste, which simply means the divine in me recognizes and honors the divine in you. And our understanding of the divine is different. But as Christians, as a Christian, when I say that, it reminds me of this live ever aware of God's presence.
Yeah.
Constantly looking for and recognizing the divine in one another, in all of creation. And if we did that,
maybe that's our anointing every morning.
Maybe that is our anointing.
Maybe we take that phrase and just put it on our mirrors or wherever we look in the morning and just say, today I will be aware of God's presence. And that's our anointing to go out into the world and do what we need to do.
We should put that on a coffee mug.
We should put that on a coffee
mug. Or a
keychain. Sure. I love that. Oh, this has been, again, such a wonderful journey through Philip Keller's A Shepherd Looks at Psalm 23. We have loved hearing from all of you who have gone out and purchased this book. It is, incredible. For being written in the 70s, it's still.
I'm not gonna lie. When Renee brought that book out the first week,
I had questions.
I was I was a little hesitant, but it's been rich.
It has been incredibly rich and valuable, and yes, I'm thankful for Renee's suggestion of this book, absolutely. But that means that we're moving into something else now, And for those of you that have been watching,
Drum roll.
yes, so we are moving in next week, starting with our Bible study series on verses that you have recommended as viewers. We're starting with Bill Shelton's recommendation of Micah 6:8. So we'll be diving into that a little bit more deeply next Sunday. But if you want to send us a suggestion for a verse, if you want to send us any kind of feedback based on your experience of Philip Keller's book, if you just want to say hi to Renee and myself, you can do all of those things and even more by sending an email to our All Church Sunday School email. That's acss@uccftw.com. Again, just send us any kind of stuff that you want. It works.
I tested it out.
JV tested it today. And we will have about 6 or 7 weeks of Bible study based on verses that you have selected. Tell us whether that verse is important to you, whether it's been something that's challenging for you over the years, or if it's something that you're just curious to know more about. We're willing and ready to take on all of these scriptures with you. Just exploring them, I think, is going to be the fun part.
Can't wait to see what people turn in.
Me either. I mean, we've gotten a couple really good ones already.
I hope you get a doozy. One of those difficult
I want
tests.
a challenging one. I like the challenging ones. They're great.
Yeah.
So again, you can send all of that feedback and information to acss@uccftw.com. Thank you for being here again this morning. We appreciate you so much. Have a good week.